Hey, this is Mr. Spencer. We're going over the introduction to The Catcher in the Rye. We'll also do a little bit of plot summary, and you can use that plot walkthrough. See if you can fill in the blanks as you go through the first part of the book and then the second half of the book. But spoiler alert, let's read the book first. Okay, now I've got some slides here. I'll go over them with you. As I go through the slides, see if you can follow along with me. J.D. Salinger's the author. We read one of his short stories. Did you read A Perfect Day for Banana Fish? He was born in 1919. He died in 2010. He lived to 91 years old. There's a picture of him with his first wife. He met her in Germany. He thought she was Polish. Turned out later she might have been a German spy during the war. He was a little embarrassed. Did she fool him? He grew up in New York City. He briefly went to New York University, NYU, and Columbia University before serving in World War II. He was in the infantry, the army, and also ended up working a lot for intelligence and counterintelligence. He stormed the beaches of Normandy, and he wrote many short stories even while he was away, stationed in the army during the war, sending them back over the sea to get them published. Okay, he published The Catcher in the Rye. 1951, it became a big hit, an instant success for him, but he shied away from the limelight. He was embarrassed by the fame that it brought him. He hated the public life, and he left the big city of New York, and he went to New Hampshire, out in the suburbs, way out in the country, and he refused all interviews. He did very, 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 very few interviews in his life, like maybe one. He continued to write, but he stopped publishing. Do you understand? He kept writing, typing, but didn't share it, didn't publish it until the age of 91. He stipulated in his will that upon his death, his newer writings wouldn't be published for 50 years. So he died in 2010. Does that mean 2060? His son is trying to get some of them published. You can check in the news right now, search his name, J.D. Salinger, in the news, and you might see if his son has those new stories ready to go. Okay, next. We're going to talk about the Beatles. What? Well, check it out with Mr. Spencer. Who shot John Lennon of the Beatles? Have you seen my Beatles poster up there? In 1980, there was a guy named Mark David Chapman. He shot John Lennon, who was the singer of the Beatles. He's the one dressed in white here on their album Abbey Road from 1969. Mark David Chapman, there's his mugshot there. He was arrested, and he had a worn old copy of the book, and inside he had scribbled a note that said, "Dear Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield, this is my statement." Holden Caulfield is the main character of this book. Later, Mark David Chapman, after shooting John Lennon, read a passage from his novel to address the court during his sentencing. How do you think J.D. Salinger felt when hearing the news that this famous person was shot because this guy claimed this book made him do it? If you were an author, how would you feel if that happened? Shot in cold blood in front of his wife outside the music studio on the streets of New York City. There was a movie that Jared Leto starred in, which is called Chapter 27. So I think it's rated R, but it's the name of a movie that Jared Leto did based on this life of Mark David Chapman. Okay, so check with your parents first. It's rated R. All right, back to the slides here. The book's been censored a lot. Okay, in 1960, the first time a teacher used the book in his high school class, he was fired for assigning it. He was later reinstated, but this started the very complicated censorship history the book had. Between 1961 and 1982, it was the most censored book in high schools and libraries. And in 1981, it was also both the most censored book and the second most taught book in public schools. It became very frequently challenged throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, and although it was off the list for a few years in 2009, it did reappear as the most challenged book. The main reason it's censored is for its explicit language. You'll see a couple F words and also GD, not gosh darn it, but something even stronger. And some people found that very offensive. Okay, so some of the subject matter is very adult. Okay, but we're trying to read this, study it, like it's any other thing in school. We'd be learning about history, language, the humanities, literature. Okay, so reader discretion advised. Now, the time period the book takes place, it's right after World War II, the 1940s and 50s. This was a time of extreme conformity for Americans. It was the baby boomer generation. Lots of new families started being developed when the soldiers came back after the war and the husbands and wives were ready to settle down. Okay, boomer. There were a lot of group norms, gender roles, class behavior, sexuality norms, and they were closely followed. Conformity. Individualism was frowned upon and was seen as threatening to many of these people. And the typical image of a nuclear family with a father, mother, and 2 children living in a middle-class suburban home was what most people expected of their family life. The first person point of view is the one thing you'll notice from page 1. The novel's meaning and plot come through the main character Holden's thoughts and observations. So as you're reading the book, you'll see the main character named Holden telling us his thoughts and feelings in first person point of view. As readers, we sort of get to play psychoanalyst. We need to analyze the thoughts and feelings of Holden for their significance for him and for the novel as a whole. Okay, the reason an author might write 200-300 pages of a book is because there might be themes or lessons that they can't just explain in 1 or 2 sentences. These are themes or lessons that are so complex that it might take hundreds of pages to get the full meaning behind these themes and these lessons. He also uses a lot of slang and profanity in the book, and it creates a sense of realism and highlights his desire to rebel against social norms. The key question as you read is Holden a reliable narrator? Okay, so we're going to go into the plot summary here. Chapter 1. Read the book first, okay? This is just to help you after you read if you get confused or lost. Okay, Holden Caulfield. He casually starts the story by saying he's just going to tell what happened to him just before the previous Christmas. So it appears he's writing this, and we're reading what he's written. Holden's story begins at his school, Pensy Prep, on the day of an annual football game that all the students normally attend. It's a fictional school. Instead of going to the game, Holden, who's just been expelled for failing 4 of his 5 classes, visits Mr. Spencer, his elderly history teacher. The one class he's not failing is English class. Where is everybody? I thought people would come to class today. Are you online? Yes, okay. Summary, Chapter 2. Mr. Spencer is the name of his old teacher. Just a coincidence, guys. I didn't write this book. Just a coincidence. Mr. Spencer lectures Holden by agreeing with what the headmaster, Dr. Thurmer, has already told him, namely that life is a game which ought to be played by the rules. And this, Mr. Spencer insists, is an important thing to internalize as Holden plans for his future. As he listens, though, Holden pretends to agree with Mr. Spencer, but he actually thinks that his teacher is something of a phony. So, the next part of the book, Chapter 2 later, as the conversation continues, Mr. Spencer, cringeworthy, forces Holden to read him aloud an unsatisfactory essay that Holden wrote about the ancient Egyptians. And this makes Holden resent him, since he already knows that he didn't put enough effort into the assignment. Consequently, he lies and says he has to leave to collect his things. He doesn't want to read the essay out loud to his teacher that he failed, though he simply returns to his dorm room to read. So he gets out of there. Chapter 3. Once he's back in his room, Holden is confronted by his irritating neighbor, Ackley, which sounds similar to acne. He's got pimples all over his face. It's his roommate at the dorm. This is a prep school, a boarding school, so the parents send their kids to live there. And it's a boys' school, so all the boys live in a dormitory. The parents have sent them there. Okay, it's like an apartment, and they have supervisors and resident advisors, RAs, that supervise and watch, okay? So you might do that if you go to college. You'll see it in the dormitories. So Ackley comes in, interrupts Holden, who is really trying to read, and he seems to like books that are about adventure or war. Later, his conceited and good-looking roommate, Ward Stradlater, bounds into the room. So Ward Stradlater, Holden asks why he returned so early from the football game. Okay, this is his third roommate. Okay, they have a common space in the middle of these dorms and then 2 bedrooms on opposite sides of the common room, okay? Ackley, Stradlater, and now Holden. So he's back from the football game because Stradlater's getting ready for a date with a girl named Jane Gallagher. This catches Holden off guard since he knows Jane. He spent time with her when she lived next door to him 2 years ago when his family summered in Maine. So old childhood friends? As Stradlater prepares for his date, though, Holden goes on at length about Jane, talking about her, explaining small details about her personalities. And as he speaks, it becomes clear that he's quite attached to his memories of Jane. As we read, it's almost like Holden gets lost between the past and the present. And Stradlater, though, he only cares about whether or not he's going to sleep with Jane. Holden doesn't like this. This unnerves Holden. He gets nervous and shaky. And he doesn't say anything, but he even agrees, okay, he'll do Stradlater's English homework assignment for him while he's gone. Remember, that was the only class Holden was doing good at. The assignment is to just write a short descriptive essay. So Holden chooses to write about his dead brother, Allie's baseball mitt. Apparently, Allie, his brother, had gotten leukemia, but he died. So the baseball mitt had green poetry written inside, and Holden decides that's what he's going to write about. Stradlater never told him what the essay was supposed to be about. It was just supposed to be descriptive. He said, make it descriptive as heck. So that's what Holden does. By chapter 6, though, hours later, Stradlater returns from the dorm to the dorm from his date. Holden, he's been on edge ever since he left, wondering what Stradlater was doing with Jane, his old buddy, his old friend. Instead of answering Holden's questions about the date, though, Stradlater reads what Holden has written, and he criticizes him for not following the rules, claiming he told him he had to have the essay about like a place or a house, describe a setting. Offended and angry, Holden snatches the composition about his dead brother's baseball mitt and rips it to pieces. Whoosh. Then he presses Stradlater later in chapter 6 for more details about his date with Jane. The tense conversation makes him even angrier, so he punches Stradlater and calls him a moron. Because he's bigger, though, Stradlater quickly gets the best of him, presses Holden to the floor. And this doesn't stop Holden, though, from calling him a moron, prompting Stradlater to knock him once and for all to the ground. Okay? So I think they were in the bathroom of the dormitory. They're fighting in the bathroom, wrestling. In the aftermath of his fight with Stradlater, Holden decides to leave Pensy early, get out of school. He leaves school. He's not going to wait for them to suspend him. He's not going to wait for them to expel him for his grades, so he decides he's leaving. He's planning to stay in just New York City until his parents receive the news that he's been expelled. Might take a few days to get in the mail and get that contact information back to his parents, so Holden has a little bit of an adventure that he's going to go on. Adventure awaits while he tries to start a little bit of free thinking. He doesn't really want his parents to learn what's happened, so he waits. Heads off on his own. Gathering his things, he turns before exiting the dorm building and he yells, "Sleep tight, you morons," at the end of chapter 7. He then takes a train to New York in chapter 8. He flirts with a middle-aged woman on the train, and he rents a room at the Edmont Hotel when he arrives. Now, after flirting with that middle-aged woman on the train in chapter 8, he was claiming to be real close friends with a fellow Pensy schoolmate, Ernest Morrow, who was the woman's son. And he uses this to his advantage, even offers her cigarettes. She seems very charmed by him, and Holden has a little bit of gray in his hair. And the gray color streak in his hair, I guess, makes him think he can flirt with older women. It's very curious what he does with this woman there. But they just talk playfully. After flirting with her, Holden rents the room at the Edmont Hotel, which is pictured right there. A huge, fairly expensive hotel. Why doesn't Holden go home, you have to ask? Why won't he tell his parents he left school? Is he embarrassed? Is he ashamed? Or is he just too cool for school? Is this similar to Chris McCandless? Do you remember Chris McCandless? He graduated college, left, but then never told his parents where he was. Adventuring free thinker. Chris McCandless, Holden Caulfield. Chapter 10. Before long, Holden feels lonely and depressed and starts acting strangely. Going downstairs to the hotel's nightclub, he dances with an attractive blonde woman. He later learns his name, Bernice Krebs. She's completely uninterested in him, and she's kind of dumb. And instead of wanting to spend time with her two friends, Holden's not shy, though. He keeps taking pleasure in how good of a dancer he is. He flirts and talks with them. He's having a good time. He's even trying to get some drinks from the waiter, showing off his gray hair, even though he's not old enough, not over 21. Holden's only 16. Okay, so Holden tries to have some fun there. However, he soon tires of Bernice and her friends because he thinks they're phony. Remember, he also called his teacher, Mr. Spencer, pretty phony. So he decides to take a taxi to a piano bar he used to frequent with his older brother, DB, in New York. Remember DB? He lives out in Hollywood, California, writing scripts for the movies. Holden said that in chapter 1, you remember? As Holden leaves the hotel, he starts thinking about the girl Stradlater went on the date with, Jane Gallagher. Okay, in chapter 11 here, Holden goes back into a memory, and as kids, he remembers how their families had rented neighboring houses, and Holden and Jane spent virtually all their time together. They usually just played checkers, but they would sometimes go to the movies and hold hands with each other. And this, Holden says, is as close as they usually came to physical intimacy, though he does recount one time when they went beyond simply holding hands. They were playing checkers, apparently. And in chapter 11, Jane's alcoholic stepfather was nearby. We learn his name was Mr. Cudahy. And he entered and asked where his cigarettes were. He seemed pretty drunk, potentially abusive. Jane didn't respond, and when her stepfather left, a single tear fell onto the checkerboard. Seeing this, Holden got up and sat next to her, taking her in his arms and kissing her face, everywhere, that is, except her lips. What's implied here? Was Jane's stepfather abusing her? Was it physical abuse? Could it have been sexual abuse? Why was she crying? It's left uncertain, ambiguous. But Holden has a soft spot for Jane, and that might also explain why he got so angry with Stradlater for just wanting to take her out on a date and only cared about her physically. So Holden's worried more about emotions. Chapter 11 later, he remembers how happy he was when he held Jane's hand, and he says that she was the only person he ever showed Allie his dead brother's baseball mitt to. As he thinks these thoughts, he sits in a lobby in a chair, has a disgusting stain on it, and he suddenly feels depressed. And several times through the book, you'll see Holden feeling really down and lousy. And he starts thinking of someone maybe he would want to talk to, maybe someone he could call on the phone with a little payphone. This is the 1940s. He couldn't just send out a text or a snap. Okay, so we go to chapter 12. Okay, chapter 11 and 12, he gets away from the hotel, decides to go to the piano bar his brother DB once took him to. But on the way, he wears a red hunting cap he recently bought. And he asks the cab driver in chapter 12, what happens to the ducks in the Central Park Lagoon during the winter? The cab driver's like, seriously, bro? So in chapter 12, where do all the ducks go in the winter? The cab driver tells him that he should really care more about those fish in the winter since they have to stay in the frozen water. They don't move. Clearly, there's a deeper meaning to this. Could you think about it more? All the same, the cab driver insists that nature takes care of the fish, urging Holden not to worry about such things. Okay, look at your orange book cover to see the Central Park background. And you can see that little background there. That's supposed to be Central Park. All right, so chapter 13 of 14, things get even crazier. And this is where I'll stop the summary for this video. After an unexciting time at the piano bar, Holden returns to the hotel, takes the elevator back to his room. On the way, the elevator operator, Maurice, offers to send a prostitute to his room for $5. He says, you interested in a little tale? Tale means sex. So he's offering to send a hooker or a prostitute. Okay, Holden agrees, but he's so uncomfortable when the prostitute shows up, Sunny, that he says no, he can't be physical with her because of a recent surgical operation, which seems to be just Holden lying because he's so nervous about this. He's only 16, but Holden's trying to act like he's an adult here. Hearing this, that he won't do anything physical, she demands $10, but he only pays her $5 that he and Maurice in the elevator agreed to. It appears that Maurice is probably her pimp. He arranged this and set up the hooker. Shortly thereafter, Sonny returns with Maurice, the pimp, who punches Holden in the stomach, while Sonny takes another $5 from his wallet. What happens next? It's up to you to keep reading. Okay, you should be about halfway through the book here. And in my copy of the book here, when you finish up chapter 14 and 15, you should be over pages 100, probably up to page 126 is what I've got. Okay? Hope you like the book so far. We're only halfway through. What adventurous free thinking is Holden going to get up to next as he wanders around New York City? If you have any questions, send me a message. Read ahead if you want to read ahead. This has been Mr. Spencer signing off.